24. The night Levin had spent on the haycock had not passed without leaving its mark. He became disgusted with the agricultural pursuits on which he was engaged, and lost all interest in them. In spite of the splendid harvest, he had never, or thought he had never, encountered so many failures, or so much hostility from the peasants, as that year. And the cause of those failures and that hostility were now quite plain to him. The delight he had felt in the labour itself, occasioned by his having drawn nearer to the peasants, his jealousy of them, his envy of their life, his desire to adopt that kind of life, which had not been a mere desire that night, but a real intention, the details of which he had considered. All these things together had so changed his outlook on the working of his estate that he could no longer feel his former interest in the work, or help noticing the unpleasant relation to the labour on which it was all based. Herds of cattle of an improved breed like Pava, the tilled land ploughed with good ploughs, the 9 fields surrounded with willows, the hundreds of acres of deeply manured land, the seed drills, and all such things, were splendid if they could be worked by himself alone, or with the help of friends and people in sympathy with him. But now he clearly saw the book on agriculture which he was writing, in which the labourer was the chief factor in farming, helped much in this direction. That the agricultural work he was carrying on was founded on a bitter and obstinate struggle between himself and his labourers, in which on the one side, there was a continual and strenuous attempt to bring everything into accord with what were considered the best models, while on the other side there was the natural order of things. And he saw that in his struggle, in spite of extreme efforts on his part, and without any effort or even intention on the part of others, the only results achieved were that neither side was the winner, and that fine tools and splendid cattle and soil were quite uselessly damaged. But the chief point was that not only was the energy expended on the work wasted, but he could not help feeling now, when he saw the meaning of his pursuit laid bare before him, that the aim of his efforts was a most unworthy one. What was the essential cause of that hostility? He struggled to get every penny he could, and had to do so, or he would not have been able to pay his labourers their wages. And they struggled to be allowed to work quietly, pleasantly, and just as they were used to work. It was to his interest that every labourer should get through as much work as possible, and at the same time give his mind to it, not injuring the winnowing machine, the horse rake, or the threshing machine, but working intelligently. The labourer wished to work in the pleasantest way possible, with intervals of rest, and especially to think unconcernedly about other things without having to reason. During that summer, Levin noticed this continually. He gave orders to mow the clover for hay, choosing the inferior fields overgrown with grass and hemlock and not fit for seed. And they cut down all the best seed clover, defended themselves by saying that the foreman ordered them to do it, and comforted him with the assurance that he would get splendid hay, while he knew that they had done it simply because that clover was easiest to mow. He sent out the horse rake to turn the hay, and it got broken while tossing the first few rows, because the peasant found it dull to sit in the seat under the rotating wings, and Levin was told, "Don't worry, sir, the women will toss it all in no time." The English ploughs turned out useless, because it never entered the peasant's head to lower the upturned ploughshare, and as he forced it through at the turning, he spoiled the ground and strained the horses, and Levin was told not to worry. The horses were allowed to stray into the wheat field, because not one of the peasants wanted to be watchman, and in spite of its having been forbidden, the labourers took turns to watch the horses at night. So Vanka, who had been at work all day, fell asleep, and confessed his guilt, saying, "I am in your hands, sir." 3 of the best calves had been overfed by being turned into the meadow where the clover had been cut, without any water to drink. And the peasants would on no account admit that the clover had injured them. To comfort Levin, he was told that his neighbour had lost 100 head of cattle in 3 days. All this happened not because anyone wished to harm Levin or his farming. On the contrary, he well knew that they liked him and considered him a homely gentleman. High praise from a peasant. It was done simply because the labourers wished to work merrily and without care, while his interests were not only foreign and incomprehensible to them, but flatly opposed to their own just interests. Levin had long felt dissatisfied with his relation to the work on his estate. He had seen that the boat was leaking, but had not found or looked for the leak, and perhaps had purposely deceived himself, for had he been disillusioned in that work, he would have had nothing left. But now he could deceive himself no longer. His agricultural pursuits had not only ceased to interest him, but had become repulsive, and he could no longer give his mind to them. Added to this, there was Kitty Shcherbazkaya, not more than 20 miles away, and he wanted to meet her, yet could not. When he called on Dolly, she had asked him to come again, and come with the object of once more proposing to her sister, letting him feel that her sister would now accept him. Levin himself, having seen Kitty Shcherbazkaya, knew that he had not ceased to love her. Yet he could not go to the Oblonskys' house while she was there. That he had proposed and she had refused had put an impossible barrier between them. I cannot ask her to be my wife just because she cannot be the wife of the man she wanted, he said to himself, and this thought rendered him cold and hostile toward her. I shall not have the strength to speak to her without reproach, or to look at her without ill will, and she will only hate me all the more, as it is only right she should. Besides, how can I go there now after what Darya Alexandrovna told me? Can I help betraying what she told me? And I should come magnanimously to forgive her, to show mercy to her. I stand before her in the role of one who forgives, and honours her with his love. Why did Darya Alexandrovna tell me this? I might have met her accidentally, and then all would have come naturally, but now it is impossible. Dolly sent to him to ask for a side saddle for Kitty. I have been told, she wrote, that you have a side saddle. I hope you will bring it yourself. That was more than he could stand. How can an intelligent woman with any delicacy so humiliate his sister? He wrote 10 notes and tore them all up, sending the saddle at last without a reply. To say that he would come was impossible, because he could not come. To say that something prevented him from coming, or that he was leaving home, was still worse. He sent the saddle without an answer, conscious of doing something shameful. And next day, putting the disagreeable management of the estate into the hands of the steward, he went away to a distant district to visit his friend Sviatchky, who had splendid shooting, and had long been asking him to come and stay with him. The snipe marshes in the Surovsky district had for a long time appeared tempting to Levin, but he had put off his visit because of his farm work. But now he was glad to go away from the proximity of Kitty and from his farm, and especially to go shooting, an occupation which served him as the best solace in all his troubles. 25. There was no railway or stagecoach to the Surovsky district, and Levin went in his own tarantas. Halfway, he stopped to feed his horses at a well-to-do peasant's house. The bald-headed, fresh-faced old man, with a red beard which was growing grey round the cheeks, opened the gates and pressed close to the post to let the 3-horsed vehicle enter. After showing the coachman to a place in a lean-to, in a large, clean, tidy, newly constructed yard, where stood some charred wooden ploughs, the old man invited Levin to enter the house. A cleanly dressed young woman, with goloshes on her stockingless feet, was washing the floor in the passage. The dog that followed Levin frightened her, but when she was told that it would not hurt her, she at once began to laugh at her own alarm. After pointing to the door with her bare arm, she again stooped, hiding her handsome face, and went on scrubbing. "Want a samovar?" she asked. "Yes, please." The room Levin entered was a large one, with a tiled stove and a partition. Under the shelf with the icons stood a table decorated with a painted pattern, a bench, and 2 chairs. By the door stood a little cupboard with crockery. The shutters were closed, and there were not many flies in the room, which was so clean that Levin took care to keep Laska, who had been bathing in the puddles on the way, from trampling on the floor, telling her to lie down in a corner by the door. Having looked round the room, he he went out into the backyard. The good-looking woman in galoshes, with 2 empty pails swinging from a wooden yoke, ran down before him to fetch water from the well. "Look alive!" the old man called merrily after, and approached Levin. "Is it to Nicholas Ivanitch Sviazhsky you are going, sir?" "He too stops at our place," he began garrulously, leaning on the banisters of the porch. In the midst of his conversation about his acquaintanceship with Sviazhsky, the gates creaked again, and the labourers returning from the fields came into the yard with their ploughs and harrows. The horses harnessed to the ploughs and harrows were big and well fed. The labourers evidently belonged to the household. 2 young fellows wore print shirts and peaked caps. 2 others were hired men and wore homespun shirts. One of these was old, and the other young. The old master of the house left the porch and went to unharness the horses. "What have they been ploughing?" asked Levin. "Between the potatoes. We too rent a little land." "Don't let the gelding out, Fedov. Lead him to the trough. We'll harness another." "I say, father, have those ploughshares I ordered been brought?" asked a tall, robust young fellow, evidently the old man's son. "There in the passage," answered the old man, winding the reins into a ring and throwing them on the ground. "Fix them in before we finish dinner." The good-looking woman returned, her shoulders pressed down by the weight of the full pails, and went into the house. Other women, young and handsome, middle-aged, old and plain, some with children, others without, appeared from somewhere. The chimney of the samovar began to hum. The labourers and the family, having attended to the horses, went in to dinner. Levin took his provisions out of the tarantas and invited the old man to have tea with him. "Why, I don't know. We've had tea once today," said he, evidently pleased to accept the invitation. "Well, just for company." Over their tea, Levin heard the whole history of the old man's farm. 10 years previously, he had rented about 400 acres from the landowner, and the year before, he had bought them outright and rented another 900 from a neighbouring proprietor. A small part of the land, the worst, he let, and with the aid of his family and 2 hired men, cultivated about 120 acres. The old man complained that his affairs were in a bad way. But Levin knew that he only did so for propriety's sake, and that in reality his farm was flourishing. Had his affairs been in a bad way, he would not have bought land at 35 rubles an acre, would not have married 3 of his sons and a nephew, and would not have twice rebuilt his homestead after fires, nor rebuilt it better each time. In spite of the old peasant's grumbling, one could see that he was justly proud of his property, of his sons, his nephew, his daughters-in-law, his horses, his cows, and especially of the fact that his whole household and farm held together. From their conversation, Levin gathered that he was not against new methods either. He had planted many potatoes which had already flowered and were forming fruit, as Levin had noticed when passing the fields on the way, while Levin's own potatoes were just beginning to flower. He ploughed the land for the potatoes with an English plough, which he had borrowed from a landowner. He also sowed wheat. Levin was struck especially by one little detail. The old peasant used the thinnings of the rye as fodder for the horses. Many a time when Levin had seen this valuable food wasted, he had wanted to have it gathered up, but had found this impossible. On this peasant's field, this was being done, and he could not find words enough to praise his fodder. "What is that for the young women to do? They carry the heaps out onto the road, and a cart comes and fetches them." "There now, we landlords don't get on well because of the labourers," said Levin, handing him a tumbler of tea. "Thank you," said the old man as he took the tea, but he refused sugar, pointing to a bit he still had left. "How can one rely on work with hired labourers?" he said. "It's ruination. Take Sviazhsky now. We know what sort of soil his is, black as poppy seed, but he cannot boast of his harvests either. It's want of attention." "And yet you too use hired labour on your farm?" "Ours is peasant's business. We look after everything ourselves. If a labourer is no good, let him go. We can manage for ourselves." "Father, Finnegan wants some tar fetched," said the woman with the galoshes coming in. "That's how it is, sir," said the old man, rising, and after crossing himself several times, he thanked Levin and went out. When Levin went into the back room to call his coachman, he found the whole peasant family at dinner. The women served standing. The vigorous young son, with his mouth full of buckwheat porridge, was saying something funny, and everybody laughed heartily. The woman with the galoshes laughing more merrily than anyone, as she refilled the bowl with cabbage soup. The handsome face of this woman with the galoshes might very well have had something to do with the impression of welfare that this peasant household produced on Levin. That impression was anyhow so strong that he never lost it. And all the rest of the way to Sviatchky's, he every now and then recalled that household, as if the impression it had left on him demanded special attention. 26. Sviatchky was marshal of the nobility in his district. He was 5 years older than Levin and had long been married. His young sister-in-law, whom Levin thought very pleasant, lived with them. He knew that both Sviatchky and his wife wanted to see her married to him, Levin. He knew this as certainly as all so-called eligible young men know these things, though he could never have said so to anyone. And he also knew that although he wanted to marry, and although this girl, to all appearance very fascinating, ought to make a splendid wife, he could as soon fly as marry her, even had he not been in love with Kitty. And this knowledge spoiled the pleasure which he hoped his visit to Sviatchky would give him. Levin had thought of this when he received Sviatchky's invitation, but in spite of it, he made up his mind that this idea of Sviatchky's intentions was only an unfounded conjecture of his, and that he would go. Besides, at the bottom of his heart, he wanted to put himself to the test, and again to estimate his feelings for the girl. Sviatchky's home life was extremely pleasant, and Sviatchky himself was the best type of social worker that Levin had ever known, and Levin always found him very interesting. Sviatchky was one of those people, they invariably amazed Levin, whose judgment was very logical, though never original, and was kept quite apart from their conduct, while their manner of life was very definite and stable, its tendency being quite independent of their judgment, and even clashing with it. Sviatchky was an extreme liberal. He despised the gentry, and considered the majority of noblemen to be secretly in favour of serfdom, and only prevented by cowardice from expressing their views. He considered Russia to be a doomed country like Turkey, and the Russian government so bad that he did not think it worthwhile seriously to criticize its action. Yet he had an official position, was a model marshal of the nobility, and when he travelled, always wore a cockade and a red band to his cap. He imagined that to live as a human being was possible only in foreign countries, where he went to stay at every opportunity. Yet he carried on very complicated and perfected agricultural pursuits in Russia, and carefully followed and knew what was being done there. He considered the Russian peasant to be 1 degree higher than the ape in development. Yet at district elections, no one shook hands with the peasants and listened to their opinions more willingly than he. He believed in neither God nor devil, yet he was much concerned by the question of improving the condition of the clergy and limiting parishes, and was at the same time particularly active in seeing that the church should be retained in his village. On the woman's question, he sided with the extreme advocates of woman's freedom, and especially the right to work. Yet he lived with his wife in such a way that it gave everybody pleasure to see the friendly relationship in which they passed their childless life, and had so arranged that his wife did nothing and could do nothing except share her husband's efforts to spend their time as pleasantly and merrily as possible. Had Levin not possessed the faculty of giving the best interpretation to people's characters, Sviatchky's character would have presented no difficulty or problem to him. He would only have called him a fool or a good-for-nothing, and everything would have been clear. But he could not call him a fool, because Sviatchky was not only very intelligent, but also a very well-educated man, who carried his education with extreme modesty. There was no subject with which he was not acquainted, but he only exhibited his knowledge when forced to do so. Still less could Levin call him a good-for-nothing, because Sviatchky was certainly an honest, kind-hearted and clever man, always joyfully and actively engaged on work highly prized by all around, and certainly a man who could never consciously do anything bad. Levin tried but could not understand him, and regarded him and his life as animated riddles. The Sviatskys were friendly with Levin, and therefore he allowed himself to sound Sviatsky and try to get to the very foundation of his philosophy of life. But it was all in vain. Each time that Levin tried to penetrate deeper than the reception rooms of the other's mind, which were always open to anybody, he noticed Sviatsky seemed a little confused. A just perceptible look of fear appeared on his face, as if he were afraid that he would be understood by Levin, whom he met with good-natured, jocose resistance. Now, after his disillusion with the work on his estate, Levin was especially pleased to stay a while with Sviatsky. Not to mention the fact that the sight of the happy doves in their well-ordered nest, so content with themselves and everybody else, had a cheering effect on him. He now wanted, dissatisfied with life as he was, to get at the secret which gave Sviatsky such clearness, definiteness, and cheerfulness. Levin also knew that he would meet neighbouring landowners at the Sviatskys, and it would be very interesting to talk and hear about farming, the harvest, the hire of labour, and all those questions which, though considered very low, seemed to him most important. These matters might not have been so important in the time of serfdom, and may be unimportant in England. In these cases, the conditions were or are settled. But with us, everything has only just been changed, and is only beginning to settle down. The question of how things will settle down is the only important question in the whole of Russia, thought Levin. The shooting did not prove as good as he had expected. The marsh had dried up, and there were hardly any snipe. He went about all day and only brought back 3. But on the other hand, he brought back, as he always did after a day's shooting, a splendid appetite, good spirits, and the stimulated mental condition, which in his case always accompanied physical exertion. And when out shooting, while he did not seem to be thinking at all, he again and again thought about the old peasant and his family, and felt as if the impression made on him called not only for his attention, but for the solution of some problem related thereto. In the evening at tea, a very interesting conversation sprang up, just as Levin had expected, in the company of 2 landlords who had come about some guardianship business. Levin sat beside the hostess at the tea table, and was obliged to converse with her and her sister, who was sitting opposite him. The hostess was a short, fair, round-faced woman, beaming with smiles and dimples. Levin tried to find out through her the answer to the riddle, so important to him, presented by her husband. But he had not full freedom of thought, because he felt painfully uncomfortable. This painful discomfort was due to the fact that her sister sat opposite to him in a dress that seemed to him to have been put on especially for his benefit, with a particularly low, square-cut décolletage, showing her white bosom. Though her bosom was so white, or perhaps because it was so white, this square cut deprived Levin of his freedom of thought. He imagined, probably quite mistakenly, that the bodice was cut like that on his account. He felt that he had no right to look at it, and tried not to do so, but felt guilty because it was cut so. Levin felt as if he were deceiving someone, as if he ought to offer some explanation which was impossible, and therefore he kept blushing, and was restless and uncomfortable. His discomfort communicated itself to the pretty sister, but the hostess did not seem to notice anything, and purposely drew his sister into the conversation. "You say," the hostess continued, "that my husband cannot feel an interest in anything Russian. On the contrary, though he is happy abroad, he is never so happy there as here. He feels in his own sphere. He is so busy, and he has a gift for taking an interest in everything. Ah, you've not been to see our school." "I saw it. It is a little ivy-covered house." "Yes, that's Nastya's business," she said, pointing to her sister. "You yourself teach?" asked Levin, trying to look beyond the bodice, but conscious that if he looked in her direction, he must see it. "Yes, I have been and am still teaching, but we have a splendid master, and we have introduced gymnastics." "No thanks, no more tea," said Levin, and unable to continue the conversation, though he knew he was behaving rudely, he got up blushing. "I hear a very interesting conversation there," he added, and went to the other end of the table, where his host and the 2 landlords were sitting. Sviatsky sat sideways, leaning his elbow on the table and turning his cup round with one hand, while with the other he gathered his beard together, lifted it to his nose as if smelling it, and let it go again. He looked with his glittering black eyes straight at an excited landowner, with a grey moustache, whose words evidently amused him. The landowner was complaining about the peasants. Levin saw clearly that Sviatchky could have answered the landowner's complaint, so that the meaning of the latter's words would have been destroyed at once. But owing to his position, he could not give that answer, and listened not without pleasure to the landowner's funny speech. This landowner with the grey moustache was evidently an inveterate believer in serfdom, and a passionate farmer who had lived long in the country. Levin saw signs of this in the way the man was dressed. He wore an old-fashioned shiny coat, which he was evidently not used to, and in his intelligent, dismal eyes, his well-turned Russian, his authoritative tone, evidently acquired by long practice, and in the firm movement of his fine, large, sunburned hands, the right one having an old wedding ring on the third finger. 27. If it were not a pity to give up what has been set going, after spending so much toil, I would throw it all up, sell out, and, like Nicholas Ivanitch, go away, to hear La Belle Hélène, said the landowner, a pleasant smile lighting up his wise old face. But we see you don't give it up, said Nicholas Ivanitch Sviatsky, so it seems it has its advantages. Just one advantage. I live in my own house, which is neither bought nor hired, and there is always the hope that the people will come to their senses. You would hardly believe what drunkenness and debauchery there is. The families have all separated. They've not a horse nor a cow left. They're starving, yet if you hire one of them as a labourer, he'll spoil and break things, and will even lodge complaints with the magistrate. On the other hand, you, too, complain to the magistrate. I complain? Never. Nothing could induce me to. It would cause such gossip that one would be sorry one tried it. At the works now, they took money in advance, and went off. And what did the magistrate do? Why, acquitted them. Things are only kept going by the village tribunal and the village elder. He thrashes them in the old style. If it were not for that, one had better give up everything and flee to the ends of the earth. The landowner evidently meant to tease Sviatchky, but the latter did not take offence. On the contrary, he evidently enjoyed it. Well, you see, we carry on our work without such measures. I and Levin, and he, Sviatchky said, smiling and pointing to the other landowner. Yes, Michael Petrovich gets on, but ask him how. Is his what you would call rational farming, said the landowner, ostentatiously using the word rational. My farming is very simple, thank heaven, said Michael Petrovich. My farming is to have money ready for the autumn taxes. The peasants come along and say, be a father to us, help us. Well, of course they are all our own people, our neighbours. One pities them and lends them what they want, enough to pay the 1/3 then due. But one says, remember, lads, I help you, and you must help me when necessary, at the oat sowing or haymaking, at harvest time. And one agrees for so much work from each family. But it is true there are some dishonest ones among them. Levin, who had long been acquainted with his patriarchal methods, exchanged a glance with Sviatchky, and, interrupting Michael Petrovich, addressed the landowner with the grey moustache. How then, in your opinion, should one carry on at present? Why, carry on the way Michael Petrovich does, either pay the peasants in kind, or rent it to them. That is quite possible, but the wealth of the community as a whole is ruined by such methods. Where my land used to yield 9-fold on the serfdom with good management, it only now yields 3-fold when the labourers are paid in kind. Russia has been ruined by the emancipation of the peasants. Sviatchky looked at Levin with smiling eyes, and even made a just perceptible sarcastic sign to him, ridiculing the old man. But Levin did not consider the landowner's words ridiculous. He understood him better than he did Sviatchky. Much of what the landowner said subsequently, to prove that Russia was ruined by the emancipation, even appeared to him to be very true, new, and undeniable. The landowner was evidently expressing his own thought, which people rarely do. thoughts to which he had been led not by a desire to find some occupation for an idle mind, but by the conditions of his life. Thoughts which he had hatched in his rural solitude and considered from every side. The fact of the matter is, you see, that progress can only be achieved by authority, he said, evidently wishing to show that education was not foreign to him. Take, for instance, the reforms of Peter the Great, Catherine, and Alexander. Take European history. In the realm of agriculture, it is still more so. To name only potatoes, they even had to be introduced by force into this country. Our primitive ploughs, you know, have not been always used. They must have been introduced at the time of the Rurik princes, and doubtless by force. Now in our case, we landlords under serfdom applied improved methods of agriculture. We introduced the winnowing machines and all sorts of tools, organized the carting of manure, all by our authority, and the peasants at first resisted and afterwards copied us. Now that serfdom has been abolished and the power taken out of our hands, our agriculture, where it has been brought to a high level, must descend to a savage and primitive condition. That is how I look at the matter. But why? If your farming is rational, you can carry it on with hired labor, says Sviatski. I have no power. By means of whose labor am I to carry it on? Here we have it. The labor power is the chief element of agriculture, thought Levin. Hired laborers, replied Sviatski. Hired laborers don't want to work well with good tools. Our laborers understand one thing only, to get drunk like swine, and when drunk, to spoil everything you put into their hands. They'll water the horses at the wrong time, tear good harness, change a wheel with an iron tire for one without, or drop a bolt into the threshing machine in order to break it. They hate to see anything that is beyond them. That is why the level of agriculture has gone down. The land is neglected, overgrown with wormwood, or given to the peasants. And where 8 million bushels used to be produced, they now only produce 800,000. The wealth of the nation has decreased, if the same step had been taken with due consideration. And he began to develop his plan of emancipation, which might have prevented this dislocation. But it did not interest Levin, and, as soon as the landlord had finished, Levin returned to the first proposition, and, trying to get Sviatski to express his views, said to him, the fact that our agriculture is sinking, that it is impossible, our relation to the peasants being what it is, to carry on our rational farming profitably, is quite true. I don't think so, said Sviatski, now quite serious. All I see is that we do not know how to farm, and that our farming in the days of serfdom was not at too high, but on the contrary, at too low a level. We have no machines, no good horses, no proper management, and we do not know how to keep accounts. Ask any farmer, he cannot tell you what is profitable for you and what is not. Italian bookkeeping, said the landowner scornfully. Keep your accounts as you will. If they spoil everything you've got, you won't have a profit. Why spoil everything? They will break your inferior Russian threshers, but they cannot break my steam threshing machine. The poor Russian hack, what do you call it, of the breed that you have to drag along by the tail, can be spoiled. But if you keep Flemish drays, or good Russo-Danish horses, they won't spoil them. And it's by such means that we must raise agriculture to a higher level. Yes, if one can afford it, Nicholas Ivanitch, it is all very well for you, but I have a son at the university to keep and to pay for the little one's education at the secondary school, so that I cannot buy Flemish drays. We've got banks for such cases. Yes, and finish by being sold up by auction. No, thank you. I do not believe that it is either advisable or possible to raise the level of agriculture, said Levin. I go in for it, and have means, but I never could do anything. I do not know to whom banks are useful. I, at any rate, never spent money on improvements without loss. Expensive cattle bring me a loss, and machinery too. Yes, that's quite true, said the landowner with the grey moustache, and he even laughed with pleasure. And I'm not the only one, continued Levin. I can refer you to many farmers who carry on rational farming, and with rare exceptions, they all make a loss on it. You just tell us, is your farming profitable? Said Levin, and I once noticed a momentary expression of fright which he had observed before on Sviatski's face, when he tried to penetrate beyond the reception rooms of his mind. Besides, this question was not quite honest. His hostess had told him at tea that they had engaged that summer a German from Moscow, an expert bookkeeper, and paid him 500 rubles to audit their accounts, and he found that they lost 3,000 rubles odd a year on their farming. She did not remember the exact figure, though the German had calculated down to a quarter of a kopeck. The landowner smiled when the profits of Sviatski's farming were mentioned, evidently aware of the sort of profits that his neighbour, the marshal of the nobility, was able to make. "It may be unprofitable," answered Sviatski, "but that only shows that I am either a bad farmer or that I spend capital to raise the rent." "Oh dear, the rent!" exclaimed Levin, quite horrified. "There may be such a thing as rent in Europe, where the land has been improved by the labour put into it. But with us, the land gets poorer by the labour put into it, that is, by being ploughed up. Therefore, there can be no such thing as rent." "No rent? Rent is a natural law." "Then we are outside that law. Rent does not explain anything in our case, but on the contrary, only causes confusion." "But you had better tell us how the theory of rent can be." "Would you like some curds and whey?" "Mary, send us some curds and whey or some raspberries here," said Sviatski to his wife. This year the raspberries are lasting an extraordinarily long time. And Sviatski got up cheerfully and moved away, evidently regarding the conversation as finished, at the very point where to Levin it seemed to be just beginning. Having lost his interlocutor, Levin continued the conversation with the landowner, trying to prove to him that all our difficulties arise from the fact that we do not wish to understand the characteristics and habits of our labourers. But the landowner, like everybody who thinks individually and in solitude, was obtuse to other thoughts and tenacious of his own. He insisted that the Russian peasant was a pig and loved piggishness, and that, to lead him out of the pigsty, power was needed. But there was no such power. A stick was necessary, but we had exchanged the 1,000-year-old stick for some kind of lawyers and prisons, in which the good-for-nothing stinking peasants were fed with good soup and provided with a given number of cubic feet of air. "Why do you think," asked Levin, trying to bring him back to the question, "that we could not establish some relation with labour, which would make it remunerative?" "It will never be done with the Russians. We have no power," answered the landowner. "What new conditions could be discovered?" said Sviatski, who, having eaten his curds and whey and lit a cigarette, now returned to the disputants. "Every possible relation to the power of labour has been defined and investigated," he said. "The remnant of barbarism, the primitive commune, with its reciprocal bonds, falls to pieces of itself when serfdom is abolished, and there is nothing left but free labour. Its forms are defined and ready, and we must accept them. The labourer, the hired man, the farmer, you cannot get away from them." "But the rest of Europe is not satisfied with that system." "No, it is dissatisfied, and it is seeking new methods. It will probably find them." "All I wish to say is," said Levin, "why should we not seek them for ourselves?" "Because it would be just the same as inventing new methods of building a railway. They are invented and ready." "But if they don't suit us, if they are stupid," said Levin, and again he noticed a look of fear in the eyes of Sviatski. "Ah, yes, it is all child's play for us. We have discovered what Europe is looking for. I know all that. But excuse me, do you know what has been accomplished in Europe with regard to the labour question?" "Not much. The question is at present occupying the best brains in Europe. There is the Schulze-Delitzsch trend. Then there is a whole gigantic literature on the labour question, with the most liberal Lassalle tendency. The Mulhausen system, that is already a fact. I expect you know about it." "I have some idea about it, but very vague." "Oh, you only say so. I'm sure you know about it just as well as I do. I am, of course, not a professor of sociology, but it interests me. And really, if it interests you, you had better study the matter." "But what have they arrived at?" "Excuse me." The landowners had risen, and Sviatski, Having again checked Levin, in his disagreeable habit of prying beyond the reception rooms of his mind, went to see his visitors off,